Okay, it's 2 o'clock. Welcome everybody. We've got, I think, around about 90 people already on the call. It's rising every second. My name's Graham Watts. Very pleased to welcome you all on to this webinar, the third in the series of webinars that the Construction Industry Council is presenting under the series title of The Age of the Coronavirus. This one, of course, on construction's recovery from the coronavirus. We're going to split this webinar into two sections, and I'd like to introduce the four other people on the sort of panel with me. First of all, my fellow board director at CIC, Maria Coulter, who is our champion for diversity and inclusion, and who is going to help me as a host of this webinar. And secondly, Brian Johnson and Peter Kubik, both from UHY Hacker Young, who are going to lead the first section, which is going to be about business recovery, individual businesses recovery and turnaround from the current crisis. And then secondly, Alasdair Reisner, who is a colleague of mine on the Construction Leadership Council's industry task force, looking at COVID-19 issues. I have to say I've known Alasdair, who is the CEO of the Civil Engineering Contractors Association, for many years. But since we're meeting every day on this task force, I've probably seen him more in the last 4 weeks than I saw him in the previous 15 years or something. So Alasdair will come up after Brian and Peter, and he's going to be looking at the Construction Leadership Council's plan for the industry's recovery as opposed to individual businesses. I think that I'm going to hand over to Maria in a second to talk about the sort of technicalities of the Zoom webinar, but just a couple of things from me. We're going to try and split this into two equal halves of 30 minutes each. We'll take questions through the Q&A box. So if you look for the Q&A box, which you should be able to see, rather than the chat box, but I do understand that depending on what operating procedure you've got, you may not be able to see the Q&A box. So if you can't do that, then do put the question in the chat box and we'll try and monitor that alongside the Q&A box. But it'd be easier for us if the questions come in the Q&A box. So I think with that, I'll just pass over to Maria.
Okay, thanks, Graham. I mean, I think that's pretty much everything. As Graham said, we're going to be split into to two halves on the webinar, and welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us today. So we'll have questions after the first section with Peter and Brian, and then we'll have questions after the next section with Alasdair as well, and we'll be showing presentations too. So as Graham says, if you could ask any questions, put that in the Q&A box, and we'll be monitoring those questions to make sure that they're going to be answered. And we're going to be recording this, or we are recording this right now, so it's going to be available afterwards. You can share it with your network, etc. And welcome everybody. So I'll hand back to you, Graham.
Thank you very much, Maria. So without any further ado, let me hand over to Brian and Peter.
Thanks very much, Graham, and thank you, Maria, and thanks for inviting us to talk to you this afternoon. Inevitably, given the time constraints, I think it will be a very generic talk, and Peter will butt in as and when he thinks I'm going off the rails, and I will try and keep it as far as possible to the time. At the risk of sounding trite, these are unprecedented conditions that we face, and to a large extent, as with many other areas of the economy, and as with the government, we are making it up as we go along. What we can say is that the construction industry is a key sector as far as the economy is concerned, and the government have gone some way to trying to recognise this. I think a total of 32 construction companies fell into administration in March, and in the first quarter of 2020, 90 companies have fallen into administration, which gives an indication of the vulnerability of the sector. It isn't just the question of the demand side. I think there are issues with regard to the supply side, supply of steel, depending on which area of the business you're involved in, the need to make a decision as to whether or not you close down sites, the importance of protecting your workforce, and ensuring that if you are continuing to trade, they can operate safely. All of these things mean that the area is key, and it is one that needs to be dealt with very, very carefully. We don't know what the duration is going to be, but the important thing is to be able to plan now for the survival of your business, and to look at how that business may be when we eventually come out of this this kind of coronavirus episode. What we're going to try and do is use our experience as best we can. I haven't shared my screen yet. I do apologise. As best we can. There we go. To give you some sort of insight into how you might be able to see your way through this. What we're going to look at is we're going to look at this process of review that's going to be imperative as far as you're concerned, both in terms of your contract documentation and where the company is at the moment. We're going to talk about the access that you have to information. There is a vast amount of information out there on this pandemic and the implications for the construction industry. In some respects, there's almost too much information because it is sometimes difficult to make sense of it. And we're going to try and point you in that direction. I think from an insolvency point of view, it is imperative that directors and business operators assess the risks associated with their business and its ability to continue to trade. And those risks may be very difficult to assess at the moment. We'll touch on the fact that there is talk of the suspension of the wrongful trading provisions, but in reality, I'm not sure what comfort that can really give to directors, because even with the suspension and saying from the 1st of March that directors can continue to trade their businesses, notwithstanding the fact that the company may appear on the surface to be insolvent. I'm not sure that gives you the real comfort that you need to be able to continue to trade. And I'm not sure that it absolves directors and business owners of the responsibility of ensuring that the business can trade through this time and survive once it comes out at the other end. We're going to touch on the development of a plan. We're going to touch on the importance of communicating, the most important area here, and the importance of constantly assessing and reassessing your plan as matters develop. Because as I say, we're making it up as we go along, and to a certain extent the government is making it up as well. And we're dealing with moving feasts. So it's important that one reassesses as we go through this process. And then the importance of looking at the exit and what the business is going to look like as you come out the other end, and the ability of the business, notwithstanding the support that's being provided through this period, but the ability of the business to survive coming out the other end and going forward. So those are the areas we're going to touch on. Right, first and foremost, the importance is contractual documentation in this area. Some of you may be on JCT form contracts, some of you may be on NEC contracts, sorry. Some of you may be on FIDEC contracts, some of you may not be on contracts, but even if you are on those contracts, some of the terms and conditions associated with those contracts might have changed. Now, my experience, and I've been doing this for some 30 years, the most important thing to do at the beginning of any assignment is find the contractual documentation and find the variations and amendments that have taken place. Just finding that documentation is a good start. Finding any variations is going to help, but you need to understand what the default provisions are associated with those contracts, what the extension of time provisions are, what payment of contractors' losses and expenses or termination rights may exist in those contracts, the procedural matters that are going to be part of that process, such as notice periods, must be identified and complied with. It's also important that if you have third-party agreements yourself, that you obtain that documentation and review that documentation so that you understand what the position of the company is. And that review process needs to take place in relation to contracts which you may not have entered into as yet, but which you are negotiating. It will be important to engage with your contractors and your subcontractors, as well as engaging with employers, so that you are very clear on what your position is. And I strongly recommend that you seek the advice of your lawyers or solicitors when looking at that contractual documentation, and ensure that if you are in default in any way, shape or form, that steps are taken to rectify any defaults and the necessary notices given. Notwithstanding that review, there will still be a degree of uncertainty involved with those contracts. Those contracts may include force majeure terms, and even in law, the concept of force majeure is not fully understood, and it is not a term that's necessarily used, for example, in the JCT form contract. But it will be important to understand the implications and the risk associated with that clause. I think it will also be important to have a look at any claims that you may have that are in the offing with regard to your contract, and any defaults that may have taken place, because it will be vital that you review the position on those defaults and what you're supposed to do, and as far as possible ensure that you can comply with the necessary procedures to make sure that you don't jeopardize the position with regard to your contracts and any claim you may have under those contracts. I think it's very, very important that you review your insurance documents and undertake any necessary safety action that's required under those policies, and ensure that your sites are safe, and that you advise the insurers if you have vacated sites and what steps you've taken to ensure the safety on the site. To a certain extent, some leeway, given the current pandemic, may be given by insurers, but that's not clear at the moment, and it is only by talking to your insurers that you'll be able to satisfy yourself as to what the position is. It is important, and even as an accountancy firm, we've gone through this process ourselves to produce that should be updated business plan and weekly cash flow forecast. At this stage, it should be weekly, and it should be constantly updated and rolled forward, because in this environment, as many of you will know, cash is king. You need to go through that process. I spoke about this wrongful trading issue. You need to consider whether it is safe to continue to trade, both in terms of your sites, but also in terms of not exposing yourself to a potential action for wrongful trading at some point in the future. You need to be able to chase the cash that's due and focus on that. You need to take actions to furlough staff as necessary, and many of you will, most of you will have seen that the furlough scheme that the government has in operation has effectively gone live over the last couple of days, and payments are being made. You need to, as I say, furlough as necessary, and make sure you make whatever claims you can in that respect. You need to review your existing credit facilities and liaise with your lenders. You must ensure that you are not in breach of your covenants, and that the facilities that are being provided by your lenders are adequate to allow you to get through this period and see your way out of the other side. you need to consider whether a coronavirus business interruption loan might be suitable. And again, many of you will have seen in the news today that the banks are coming under a fair amount of criticism because of the lack of speed of approving those loans. But nonetheless, it is still worth going down that track, even if ultimately you don't call down on the loan. At least you've got some sort of protection going forward should this period of lockdown last longer than is being anticipated at the moment. So you need to take those steps. You should be talking to your landlord if you're in leasehold premises to see what deferral or holidays the landlord is willing to give. You should be taking advantage of the VAT deferral arrangement from HMRC. As many of you may know, you don't actually have to contact HMRC with regard to the VAT deferral. Any payments due in relation to the period, I think Peter will correct me, beginning on the 1st of March, can be deferred for a period, and that will run until the 30th of June. And you don't have to make those payments until the end of March 2021. So it does give you a period of reasonable comfort. You need to look at and consider all the options you have available, including standstill arrangements, any forbearance agreements, which should be documented. You need to look at any amendments that you need to make to contracts, any extensions that are going to be required, and any restructuring that may be necessary, and increased indebtedness that may be required. Again, I can't emphasize this enough, and you might say, I would say that, wouldn't I? You should liaise with your lawyers and accountants to get expert advice. We're making this up as we go along to a certain extent, and any expert advice you can get will assist. There is a vast amount of information out there available which you can access without charge, including from your accountants, and I've taken the advantage to go for the hard sell there. You can see our COVID-19 web area there. You can talk to your lawyers, you can talk to the government, again, where there is a vast amount of advice, and your own trade bodies, again, which can be extraordinarily helpful and allow you to make informed decisions. The assessment of risk is key in this situation, as I've said and highlighted before. Making sites safe, because you're not protected simply because of coronavirus if those sites have not been made safe, if you decide to stop trading. You need to look at whether you can, if you decide to continue to trade safely, and ensure that your own employees are protected if trading continues. As I've highlighted initially, you need to obtain your contractual documents and look at what your contractual position is and protect that contractual position as best you can. I suspect that there will be a vast number of legal cases which will come out of this period and which will keep the lawyers busy for some time. You need to look at, as I've said, what the position is with regard to any current claims you might have in the offing and ensure that those are protected going forward. The courts are still sitting, but as you can appreciate, business is being deferred and adjourned. The arbitration process is still taking place to the extent that it can do. So things can still be done in relation to those claims, and matters can still be dealt with. But if they can't be dealt with for any reason, you just need to ensure that you protect the position of your company and your business. You need to seriously consider when you're working with an employer on a contract, whether that employer will survive, because it doesn't really matter how large your company is, you're going to be under a significant amount of pressure during this period. So the survival of your employer is going to be key as far as you're concerned. It is something that you need to look at. You need to look at whether your subcontractors will be able to survive if they're not being paid the money that is owed to them, and they're under cash flow pressure and financial pressure themselves. It is going to be very, very important, again, this issue of credit insurance. It's an open issue and so far is unresolved. The credit insurers are turning around to the government and saying that they will need support if they're going to continue with credit insurance cover. This is a live issue and one you need to keep in mind if you're providing credit to parties and you believe that you have that credit insurance. It will be well worth checking with your credit insurers to make sure that that credit insurance is still in place. You need to look at the extent of creditor pressure that you're under. This whole process will have a knock-on effect down the train, and to the extent that you're not paying your creditors, you're asking for forbearance and deferrals. You can believe that's putting pressure on your suppliers. Pressure is coming on you from above if the employer isn't paying as and when they should be paying. You need to look very, very closely at how supportive your lender is. Again, the banks are coming under a fair degree of pressure because they're not providing, even with the 80% government support, they're not providing loans as quickly as most people would like, because they're still going through the standard lending criteria and looking at whether or not these companies will survive this pandemic and whether or not they will be able to pay when they come out the other end. And that is slowing the process down significantly. Your short-term cash flow will be the most important thing for you to look at. It is a question of whether or not you're going to be able to survive. The short-term cash flow is king. In my experience, it's not your P&L that kills you, it is the absence of cash. Looking at whether your business, as I said, can survive in the short term, the medium term, and the long term. It really is a question of, well, my short-term cash flow I can deal with, but if you have to go for additional loans, an extension to your facility, you've got to look at what the business is going to look like when you come out of this process, whether the company will have sufficient working capital, whether it will be able to service any debt that it takes on, and whether or not you're going to be able to survive in the long term. So it's important that you look at that. You'll need to consider possibly, if the business may not be able to survive, whether or not formal insolvency procedures will be required. Formal insolvency procedures perhaps to protect the business. This could be a CVA, company voluntary arrangement, involving a crown down. It could be a scheme of arrangement with creditors, again involving a crown down. And there's some suggestion that the government is looking at potential new or amendments to the insolvency rules and the Insolvency Act, and these are being considered at the moment, as to whether there might be a light touch administration process, and this would involve an administration process where the directors continue in control of the company, but with an administrator overseeing the process. There could be a moratorium period that would allow the company and its directors to restructure the business and provide some sort of protection. There may be some guarantee of continuing supplies. All of these things are being considered at the moment. And as I said, we're in unprecedented areas. And this is something that Parliament, which only came back on the 21st, is currently looking at. And hopefully the measures will become clearer over the next few days. And it will give us a better idea of what provisions there are to help support and protect businesses going forward and allow them to come through this difficult period. As I've said, again, you need to look at whether you're at risk of wrongfully trading. The Section 214 of the Insolvency Act basically says that a director makes himself exposes himself to personal liability in relation to liabilities that the company continues to incur or accrue at a time when that person knew or ought to have known that there was no alternative but for the company to enter insolvent liquidation or administration. Whilst there is a suspension or a suggested suspension of these provisions being mooted at the moment, it doesn't really fully absolve the directors of responsibility for going through the process and assessing the viability of the business going forward through this period and its ability to survive at the other end. Again, there's some help from HMRC. HMRC have effectively turned around and said over the next 3 months, from the 1st of March, they're suspending their insolvency processes. Now, many of you may know that it is HMRC who are primarily responsible for most of the winding up petitions going through the courts. And that process, from their perspective, has been suspended. So again, it provides some breathing space, but it doesn't absolve directors from assessing their business properly. So looking at the plan itself, it will be vital that the plan is documented. We would recommend that it should be initially for a period of 12 months, but include a weekly cash flow for the next 3 months, and then monthly thereafter. It should set out the assumptions and details of any agreements reached that underlie the plan. It should, or you should, flex the plan depending on those assumptions about new business coming in, about potential funding, about cash collections, furloughing, and payments to creditors. So if effectively you have a range of scenarios, from worst case scenarios to your best case scenario. But after that initial 3 months rolling cash flow, then there should be at least a 12-month business plan and potentially longer, showing that the business is going to be able to survive going forward. We would highly recommend that you road test the plan with third parties, such as your accountants, to ensure its reasonableness in all the circumstances. If necessary, do factor in the potential for formal arrangements, as I said, such as company voluntary arrangements, light touch administrations or schemes of arrangement, to enable you to show that you've explored all options for ensuring the survival of the business. Once that plan has been produced, it's a working document, it's a live document that you should use in order to plan how you get through this period and come out the other end. So you should constantly review and reassess the plan and flex both your plan and cash flow as matters develop and new information comes to hand. This, I think, is probably the most important area. Again, in my experience, and I'm sure it's the same for Peter, it is about communication. You must communicate. You are in this with both your employers, your staff, your subcontractors, your suppliers, your lenders, landlords, HMRC, and your advisors, all of whom are committed to helping you see your way through this difficult period. And the more you can communicate with those parties, the greater the degree of confidence, particularly if you go through this process of developing this plan and considering all the options. You will get far greater leeway from all those parties who are stakeholders in your business than you will do without it. Remember, you're not alone in this. Then you need to think very carefully about the exit from COVID-19. It's going to end at some stage. You need to think about how you're going to be getting back to work. And again, this is something that the government's doing. And whilst it hasn't provided us with its plan at the moment, at least you can plan in your own microeconomy how it's going to work as far as you're concerned. How you're going to deal with contract variations if they're required, how you're going to deal with new work coming through, how you're going to look at paying any deferral of liabilities which may have taken place, and the financing of any additional borrowing that you might take on from your bank, because whilst business interruptions loans may be interest-free for 12 months, they will still have to be paid back. And potentially you can take them over a period of 6 years, but they still have to be paid back. And you have to look at the viability of being able to pay those loans back. As part of that, you're going to look at what profitability looks like going forward, and very much how you can come out of this stronger almost than when you went in. So in summary, there will be an end to COVID-19. When that end may be, we don't know at the moment, but it's not going to be that far off. And there has to be a survival plan for your business. First and foremost, cash is king, and you need to protect your business at this stage so that you have a business that can go forward once this period ends. You need to sort out your contractual position and make sure you fully understand your contractual position, and any amendments or protections that are required need to be put in place now as part of this process of ensuring that your business can survive when you come out the other end, when you're in a position and you want to avoid the confusion of having breached your contract without actually knowing it. Absorb information but seek advice, because there is a vast amount of help out there. Plan and action your plan. It's not a static document, it's a constantly moving document, and something you need to work to. Communicate, communicate, communicate. Communicate with all parties. They are with you through this process, and think about the exit, and don't be afraid of the restructuring options that are out there. They're designed primarily to allow the business to survive and go forward. Peter, that's all I've got to say at the moment. I don't know whether you want to make any comments.
Well, I just wanted to add, the statistics at the moment are, since we entered into lockdown, the numbers of insolvencies have dropped enormously. I mean, a lot of you out there may think as insolvency practitioners, we are exceptionally busy at the moment. That is not so. I think partly because of what the government has done to date in terms of its furloughing, the business interruption scheme loans that are available. What is happening to a lot of businesses is they are parking themselves, and unless you communicate with both your employers and your suppliers, you don't know what they're doing. You have no idea what their strategy or how their strategy is going to affect your strategy. So, as Brian was saying earlier, communication is the key to everything here. Find out what your contractors are doing, both on the supply side and on a employment side, and therefore information is king, and you will then be able to put together your assumptions for how you are going to survive. And without that communication, it's really just finger in the air and see which way the wind's blowing.
Thank you very much, Brian and Peter. That's very thorough. We've gone a minute or two over the first half an hour. So if you take your slides down and we can get Alasdair's up, I'm going to break the rule that I said at the beginning by not taking questions now, to be fair to Alasdair, so that he can make his presentation. There are only 4 questions in the question box at the moment, actually, and I think a couple of them are relevant to Alasdair's presentation. So I'll leave the questions until after Alasdair has made his presentation. So as I said, for those of you who joined since the introduction, Alasdair Reisner is the Chief Executive of the Civil Engineering Contractors Association. He's also a member, as I am, of the Construction Leadership Council COVID-19 Task Force. And in that capacity, he's been leading on convening the group, looking at a strategy for the industry as a whole to come out of recovery. So Alasdair, I'm going to hand over to you now.
Lovely. Maria, would it be possible to get my slides up, please?
Yeah, certainly. Just give me 1 second.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope it's as nice of a day outside for everyone as it is for me. I'm currently bunkered down in a dark corner of my son's bedroom, so hopefully in a quiet place for this. So as Graham said, I've been working with the Construction Leadership Council's task force, and I've got the specific task of looking at recovery of the construction sector. In some ways, it might feel like, well, hang on, it's a bit too early to be thinking about that. We're still all in lockdown. But for a lot of the things that will be important in terms of recovery, we need to be laying some of the groundwork now in order that we can come out effectively, we can come out strongly, and in doing so, we can protect as many of our businesses and employees as possible. So what I'm going to be running through today is just a little bit of our current thinking in that regard. And I'm hoping that I can move on the slides. Yeah, so as I say, the aim is to get that consistent plan for the whole industry. I think one of the lessons we've learned from the global financial crisis was the construction sector was late in coming to the government with proposals as to how to help itself, and it probably came with 10 different versions of a plan. The intention here is that there is one version of the truth that we all agree to, And so a big part of the work that we're doing is trying to get out and speak to as many stakeholders, as many businesses in the industry, so that whatever we are bringing forward is something that genuinely everyone feels that they can support. It's not a long-winded piece of work. We started first week in April. We intend to be complete by the last week in April, i.e. next week. And basically what I'm showing you today is the current thinking of where we are. And the reason I say that is I wouldn't like this to be distributed more widely after this, just because we're not sure. There is still some discussion about some of the things that I'm going to be talking about today. But I'm happy to share where we are at the moment. So to put this together, our first activity was around research, looking at what are the things that we can draw from to develop this recovery plan. It sounds terrible, but in some ways helpfully, we're not at the front of the queue in terms of being affected by COVID-19. There were other exemplar countries around the world that we could look at in terms of what they are doing now with such a fast moving thing that we can draw lessons from. So China being the obvious one of those, but we also were looking at trade press from Italy, from Germany, from Spain, and interestingly, one of the most useful places, and I would encourage anyone if they can find it, New Zealand has put together their recovery plan, and while as a nation they're probably one of the least affected, I think their recovery plan is concise, sensible, it's pitched to its own market, but it's a really good piece of work, and it's been very helpful in terms of what we're trying to achieve. Another thing, and one of the unintended consequences of Brexit, is we had done an enormous amount of work by way of preparation for what would happen to the industry in the event that there was a no-deal Brexit that was associated with a significant financial crisis in the UK. So we were rather fortuitously able to pull all of that stuff off the shelf, and that helped to inform the work that we've been doing. So we then went out to each of the task force members and asked for their views on what they recommended would be in a plan for the industry as a whole. I'm not joking when I say we literally got 101 recommendations that came from all the various groups across the industry. Clearly that would make for an entirely unmanageable plan. So we then put those recommendations back to the same group and asked them to, in essence, score for highest priorities. That was earlier this week, and in the last 24 hours, 48 hours, we've been doing some reality checks on that with Treasury, with Department for Business, just to ensure that there's nothing that we're going to try to land that isn't viable, can't be delivered within the time scale that we're looking at. Because for this bit of work, we're looking at sort of a couple of months' time to 18 months' time. It's not the immediate stuff, it's that stuff about the industry getting back off the ground and back to something approaching normality. So we've now got our draft recommendations that have come about as a result of that process. So I'm now going to just take you through what some of those draft recommendations are. So we sort of put it into three separate buckets. So the first is about restart. So this is basically when the government allows a little bit more economic activity to be taking place, what are the things that we will need to do straight out the drawer in order to start moving the industry forward and protecting businesses in what is sort of a just out of intensive care period. So they are able to work, but the problems of coronavirus haven't gone away. So there's a big element of it which we call the restart. But you know, in the sort of the vernacular of never waste a good crisis, there's also what we're calling the reset. Do we want to continue doing things the way that we've always done them, or does this actually provide an opportunity for us to look at the way the industry works itself and perhaps reset some of the ways of industry work to be more effective? And finally, that leads into Renaissance, which is really the far end of the 18-month period about how could we really be driving long-term change in the industry. So I'll just quickly fire through each of those just to give you an idea of the thinking. If as we go through you've got any questions, do drop them in the Q&A or the chat and we can pick those up at the end. So Restart. So the first part of this is about supporting the recovery, and that's the recovery of the UK economy. There's ample evidence that investment in construction is one of the most effective ways to stimulate any country's economy. So we see a real role for construction getting back to work quickly, helping to get the economy back on its feet. And there's some simple things that we can do there that don't really require any additional government funding. So just restarting the stuff that is currently switched off, all the suspended sites across the country, will give an enormous boost to economic activity. Similarly, there are some quite substantive projects that were on the point of delivery just before we went into this crisis, so that may have been due to start in March. So again, the spending has been committed there, the planning, the procurement has all been dealt with. So getting on with those, what we're calling confidence builder projects, can happen, creating employment, creating economic growth without substantive need for any parliamentary time, for any ministerial decisions. So that feels like a really good way to get a quick boost both into our industry and to the wider economy. Then there's about the things that might come slightly after that. So I have been strongly encouraged not to use the phrase shovel-ready projects, but I'm gonna. So these are those schemes that may not be absolutely ready to start, but are close enough to their start date that we could get them underway within the next 12 months. So we're looking at making sure that there is that, what we're now calling a rapid deployment pipeline, that can ensure that if we get back onto a reasonable level of output, we can sustain that through the rest of the year and on into 2021. As part of that, one of the sort of bazooka options that is available to the government, but is quite an expensive option, is its Help to Buy scheme for house building. It feels like for that sector, given the likely decline in the housing market, that has been an approach that has been ineffective in the past and could be effective again at ensuring significant volume of house building. And I think one of the things that, you know, my business is around the infrastructure sector, but this crisis has made us all realise that the entire sector is interlinked. If we don't have house building, that has impacts on products, that has impacts on materials, that has impacts on where the infrastructure is there to support housing developments. So all of these things are interconnected, and that's why we want this to be a plan for the whole of the industry, because by doing that, we ensure that everyone gets back to work, and therefore that ecosystem effect, there aren't any weak links in that holds everyone back. And finally, one of the largest constituent elements of our sector is the domestic RMI sector, the small builder that does works in homes. A crucial sector that of every part of the industry is the one that probably turned off the quickest, because put simply, consumers didn't want people they didn't know coming into their houses, even before we got into the strong lockdown. And it looks unlikely that market is going to rebound as quickly as other parts of the sector due to those specific concerns. So we're encouraging there to be a promotional campaign around how that safe working can be delivered in a domestic context, because, you know, these people are the lifeblood of the industry, and in terms of the economic impact. But if we can encourage greater work on domestic RMI, that has a multiplier effect across the whole of the UK in all local markets, rather than big hitter major projects that might do really well for one part of the country but have nothing for other parts of the country. So the next element, and it goes back to this issue about cash flow that was mentioned in Brian's presentation, is we are seeing very severe impacts among our members, amongst the wider companies in the industry in terms of their cash position. So anything we can do to support better cash within construction businesses to be welcomed. The big ticket thing there is accelerating payment through the whole of the supply chain. Now, I think the effective challenge back to that is, well, haven't we been trying to do that for 10 years, 20 years, and never got very far forward? I would put it the other way. What better time to drive through some real change on accelerating payment through the whole of the supply chain than now? And I think we've already seen really positive movement from the UK government in terms of its push for all public sector clients to speed their payments through their supply chain with open book payment down the supply chain. I'm sure it's not being effective everywhere, but we know for a fact that it is getting money into industry with a lot of the customers that we deal with. Days before we went into this crisis, the industry was hit by a new tax burden in terms of a shift in taxation on gas oil, known as red diesel. That followed a previous change in tax around what's called the reverse charge, which related to fraud in labour on construction projects. So in the next 18 months, we are anticipating some fairly big ticket changes to the tax burden on industry. We're not, as this report, recommending that those are axed or postponed. What we are recommending is that we have a conversation with HMRC so we can manage how those taxes are implemented to ensure that they don't have the unintended consequence of killing off companies at a time when they're at their most vulnerable. Then another part of the sustainable companies piece is around making sure that people can catch up with the work that they've done. I was doing some calculations last night, and I think based on the sort of run rate for output in the industry, we've probably lost about £18 billion worth of output for construction since the crisis kicked off. We're suggesting that there should be an opportunity for some slight extensions of time for work during the day for sites, extensions to the working hours. It's not going to be perfect. It's not going to catch everyone up immediately, but it will just give that slight better opportunity to get production up, to get more delivered within each individual working day, and helps catch up on some of that output. The final bit in these sustainable companies piece, again, goes to what Brian said. He was expecting, I think it was a sort of a tidal wave of disputes to come as we come out of the crisis. I suppose our job is to try and avoid that. So there is already a group looking at what can be done to try and get people to put their swords down. I think that's very difficult because obviously if your business continuity relies on you being able to make a claim against either your client or your subcontractor, it's going to be difficult to convince you not to take things to dispute. But where there are opportunities to find better ways out of things rather than through the courts, I think there is an obligation for us as a sector to see things slightly differently, not solely see things through the lens of an individual organisation, but to try and think about what's in the long-term interest of the sector as a whole. So that's our section on sustainable companies. And then we talk about the workforce. So I think one of the very earliest actions of the task force was develop the site operating procedures, which are now in their third version, which was the industry's effort at trying to make sure that everyone that comes onto one of our sites or into one of our workplaces is safe, and that the risk, particularly around the risk of COVID-19, is managed. However, we also need to be looking at, as people come back to work, what other potential risks might there be. Now that may be around ensuring that those sites are that have been suspended are set up in a way that you are managing some of the risks around COVID-19, but it may also be things around, ensuring that you're checking the temporary works and that they've had the appropriate inspections. All the things that could have changed while the site has been shut down, ensuring that the right decisions are taken to make that a safe restart. Along with that, it feels like it's important that we don't become a place where or become an industry where COVID-19 is allowed to resurge. So we are suggesting putting together guidelines on effective monitoring of employees to ensure that any cases of COVID-19 are picked up very promptly to avoid, as I say, any resurgence there. And one of the big challenges we're already seeing as an industry is the supply of PPE. It's fantastic that as an industry, we've donated well in excess of 2 million items of PPE to the NHS. And I hope that we are able to continue to do that. There will, as the industry comes back, there will also be a requirement for PPE, even just for the routine needs of PPE, before you think about what additional requirements there may be to manage COVID-19 risk. And so we need to look at what a sustainable approach to that would be, where we aren't trying to draw from supplies that are needed by the NHS. So I'm going to move on quickly to the reset stage. So this is, as I say, this is more about how we change the industry for the better in the medium term. So I think there is a piece there around working with UK Research and Innovation to look at expanding planning support. We see that streamlining planning is a great opportunity to make sure that that future pipeline of workload for the industry is there. There was also quite a strong existing work stream about the way that as an industry we buy things. So we're looking to accelerate the development and rollout of it's called the Construction Innovation Hub's value framework. So this is buying things much more based on value rather than cost, and now seems like an ideal opportunity to implement that. The sector deal, well, you know, as construction, we do have a sector deal, but maybe there's a need to look at accelerating, not acerbating. You can tell I put these slides together at short notice, and trying to bring through some of those big ticket changes, such as platform-based manufacturing and net zero technologies, while we've got the opportunity to do some of that big ticket change. And finally, in this sector, I think we need to look at some of the lessons that we have learned during this period. This itself, this webinar, is an example of how as an industry we can probably do a bit better on communication about issues. So if we can pick up some of those lessons learned and build resilience as a sector, that is another opportunity that we should be picking up. And then finally, I go on to the, I hope I do, Renaissance element. Yes, there we go. So this is, as I say, this is towards the back end of the 18 months, and it's really about the long term. And so the first bit of that is building that pipeline of opportunity. So the suggestion is to create a fund and program that will allow the development of project business cases, so you are topping up the pipeline, so there isn't a crunch at some point further down the line. The aim is to get that up and running within months, so that there is confidence within local authorities who we know are facing a tough time at the moment, that they can continue to develop schemes. Similarly, place-based recovery. This is around where we've got combined authorities, where we've got local enterprise partnerships, how we can put in place really effective built environment elements to their local growth and economic strategies. And finally, it's the sort of the extension of what I talked about earlier in terms of sorry, in fact, I've realized I've got the wrong headline here. This is actually around finance, looking at improving finance options for the industry. So working with government to see how we can improve demand side policy stimuluses. So that's looking at later on this year. I believe that's the end of my slides. But I'll say I'm more than happy to take any questions as they go up. But I'll hand back to you now, Graham.
Thank you very much, Alasdair. We've got a number of questions, and we've got about 7 minutes left. But if you don't mind, I know Alasdair's got to leave at 3, but we might go on a few minutes longer. So yeah, I'm just starting my video. We got 3 questions actually that came in more or less at the same time after the earlier presentation, all from Chris Pateman. So I'm going to group those together. 2 questions and a note, really. The first one is, good point about force majeure not being clearly defined or clearly understood in law. It would be helpful if we and the insurers could come to some kind of industry-wide understanding of what constitutes force majeure and under the current circumstances. Any thoughts? The second point he's making is in relation to VAT deferral, which is that if you're having a VAT deferral, you need to remember to cancel any automatic standing orders you have in place. I don't think we need to discuss that. And the third point is about credit insurance. Past experience is that cover disappears overnight, and the first you know is that you get a fax or an email telling you this. Is there any way of ensuring credit insurers give notice and discuss risk with customers before coming to a decision? Can we take that last one first, and I'll go over to our colleagues from UHY, to Peter and Brian. Is there something you want to say about credit insurance?
Peter, do you want to take that one?
Thank you. Again, it's all down to communication and learn what they're doing and how they're perceiving your business. Really, if you've got accurate forecasts to give them, they will act accordingly. I don't think they're just going to remove the insurance, but without communication and clear forecasts, they're going to take the worst case view and just say thanks but no thanks.
Thank you.
That
And
would be my opinion.
on the point about force majeure, I don't know if you want to say anything about that, but just from the point of view of the Construction Leadership Council, it's worth noting that this issue is being discussed at the CLC, and there is actually a contractual subgroup that is looking at these things. So it is something, when you talk about, I'm talking directly to Chris Pateman here, when you talk about an industry-wide understanding, there is some work going on about that. I don't know if Alasdair's got anything he wants to add to that.
No, I would have said exactly the same as you, Graham, that disputes avoidance group is going to be crucial to implementing that, making sure that we do have that understanding. I mean, very early on in the work of the task force, there was some guidance on contractual issues, but it was really just guidance on what things mean. If we're going to resolve this, I think that disputes avoidance group is going to be where some of the hard thinking is going to be.
Yeah. Next up, we've got a couple of questions which really are about sites remaining open. The first one is from Mark Jensen, who says, we've received some negative public response to our open sites following SOP version 3, particularly with reference to the reduced section under work planning, as it allows operatives to work within 2 meters for short durations. Please provide feedback. Well, I don't know if Alasdair wants to say something about this, but I can tell you that the negotiations to deliver the site operating procedures, the 3rd version, did go on for some considerable time. A great deal of input from both the Health and Safety Executive and Public Health England. And it is a difficult issue to deal with. I think the public opinion side, we need to sort of put to one side, because the government says that sites should remain open. People can't undertake construction work from home, therefore they can go to work, but the sites should only remain open if they can be kept open safely. And the SOP version 3 is there to give some guidance to employers about how to do that. But at the end of the day, it's the individual contractor who has to take responsibility. So if the person, the employer responsible for the site, believes that it's not possible to implement Public Health England guidance safely, then they shouldn't have the site open, and the SOP is there really to help guide that. Alasdair, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I mean, I don't think we should in any way blame the public around this. They are being told very specifically to stay at home, and then they're seeing people out working. And with the best will in the world, the message that actually construction is safe to operate isn't going to be true, because it's not a priority message for the government. It is a priority message for the government to the construction industry, but it's not in their general comms to the public. So I think the key point is we have a role as industry to try and articulate that message ourselves. I think there's an opportunity to put stuff on site hoardings. I've seen some great examples of PPE that's got printed messages on about whether people are key workers if they're working on essential utilities, just to try and reinforce that message that, you know, these guys aren't doing anything wrong. But there's also there's also a huge responsibility, because if I'm being honest, I'm looking out my window now and I can see 2 operatives, and I don't think that they need to be as close as they are, but they just happen to be working at close quarters. And so it's about really rigorously enforcing the standards that we've all agreed to, and only working within 2 meter distance where you absolutely have to.
Very good point, Alasdair. I've got another question that's directly to you, Alasdair. It says, from the conversations you are having with the industry, are they saying we are looking at a VU or some other odd-shaped recovery? I can see a tick on its side, but what are people saying? This is from James Wheeler.
Well, I think everyone is asking that question. The major sort of influencer in this will be the UK government, and to an extent Scottish and Welsh government, because if we come back too fast, you run the risk of it being a W, i.e. we come back and then there's another outbreak and we're all back at home again. But if we have a long period of being held away from work, the risk is there isn't an industry to come back at all. For reference, we're expecting nearly half the industry to fail within 3 months. And that is with the current government support around furloughing and business interruption loans. So if we're not back in 3 months, there are some really substantive problems for the industry. So my gut feeling is it will be a slow climb back out, but perhaps a quicker rise in the first phase and then a slow plateauing towards 100% activity. But I don't expect 100% activity in 2020.
Thank you, Alasdair. There's another question here from John Krause of NHBC, who is asking, is government and business in the sector genuinely interested in using reset, e.g. moving to zero lower carbon, or is it more realistic to say that the situation is so difficult that the best we can expect is a return to established practice? And that's really about greening the recovery, I think, isn't it? Can you give an answer to that?
I can, and we've had quite a lot of discussions about this, because I go to my point that I made earlier. You know, why would you want to continue doing the same thing if you've got an opportunity to reset? I think if you're looking for that to happen in the next 6 months to a year, it's probably not going to happen. But if we are putting in place stimulus to support the construction industry going forward, it seems sensible to link that stimulus to some form of reform of the way the industry does business. Why would we continue to do things in the old way if actually we get better outcomes for the economy and the environment by delivering some change? But I think we're probably talking the 18 months and beyond period rather than something more short term.
Thank you, Alasdair. Actually, I wrongly attributed John. He's from the RICS, of course, not NHBC. Sorry, John. Let's move on. Another pair of questions from, well, it's one question joined together from James Wheeler. He asks if there's any firms that we know are coming up with innovative ways of getting their workers, their teams fed and watered safely without cramming them into a random container or cabin. And he goes on to say the same applies to on-site training. I guess I can deal with that one, because the Construction Leadership Council is looking for case studies of good practice and is putting them on their website. So, and I'm sure that there are firms. I saw a video only a couple of days ago from a roofing company, which had some very interesting suggestions of how they kept their teams apart in terms of social distancing while they were fed and going through team meetings, etc. Alasdair, anything you want to add to that?
No, just to, I mean, we're putting together that website at the moment, so we are dead keen on any good practice. And if you do give it to us, we will make sure your name gets up in lights, and hopefully that helps to promote good things that people are doing across the industry. Because look, every business in the sector is grappling with the same problems at the minute. I don't think there's any competitive advantage in having a good idea on this. So the more we can share with each other, the quicker we can help the whole industry get back on its feet.
And Lynn Seeney asks, how do we make sure that we don't get into a race to the bottom, building minimum quality and maximum volume and just storing up problems that cost money to fix later when we'll still be in deficit? I mean, that's a very good question many people have asked. And I guess your answer is probably similar to the one about greening the recovery. Is it, Alasdair?
Yeah, I mean, in our discussions with Treasury, I think we look back to what happened in 2008, 2010 with the fiscal stimulus program, where they basically hosed money at the industry. And to be fair, it probably did help companies stay, with their head above the water. But I don't think the volumes of outputs that were delivered, or the outcomes that were delivered, were justified by the amount of money that was being spent. So I think we need to make sure that where the government is spending its money, it's doing so well, and that equally applies to the private sector as well.
Thank you. And then there's one from Jonathan Williams that says, the contractors I've spoken to have generally said that a lot of their projects could continue, but suppliers have generally stopped supplying. What is to be done to encourage the supply chain to reopen? Supermarkets are managing to keep going, so why can't the builders merchants? Well, actually, I have to say the builders merchants, we receive daily updates about the situation with regard to builders merchants, and they are reopening. There's no question about that. The issue, I think, is receiving supplies from the manufacturers, most of whom have their factories shut and are dealing with existing stocks. I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that, Alasdair.
No, I think you've captured it well. It's, again, whenever I have a grumble from my members, I try and put myself in the shoes of the person that we're making the grumble about. And for the products firms and the builders merchants, I think they are equally worried about the features of their businesses, and operating at 20–30% capacity is not viable for them. So for us as contractors, what we've been trying to do is illustrate to them that the demand is there if they reopen, and I think that's actually been quite successful and we are seeing significant reopenings, typically at the larger end of the market, and I think the smaller merchants, the smaller manufacturers will follow in the wake of that shortly.
Yeah, thank you. We've got quite a few. I don't think we're going to be able to get around every question, but we'll take a couple more. Yes, Dorte Rich Jurgensen asks, as part of the promotional campaign to get the domestic work into people's homes back on track, would the removal of VAT on any works be useful, especially if the works include the renovation of the homes towards a net zero and or lower carbon standard? I think that your plan covers that, doesn't it, Alasdair?
Not specifically removal of VAT. Look, this is a long-standing issue that there's a reason why we've not dealt with this in the past, and it is that we are constrained by EU regulation around what we can and cannot do in relation to domestic RMI VAT. Clearly, we are, at least in theory, leaving the EU next year, so maybe that window of opportunity does open up. It's not part of our recovery plan at the moment, just because right now it looks intractable. Maybe in that sort of next year period, it could be something we look at.
Thank you. And I'm just looking for the last one that we can take. I mean, there's several other questions here about sustainability and the government's net zero carbon. I think really you've sort of dealt with that. One last kind of generic question from Stephen Mehmet. How does the team expect post-construction sales to affect ongoing cash flow? Anybody want to give a view on that? Desperate silence.
Sorry, can you repeat the question? How do
yeah,
we expect...
it's how does the team expect post-construction sales to affect the ongoing cash flow? I'm not entirely sure I understand what it means either, actually.
Yeah.
Okay, let's pick another one then. Okay, here's one probably for UHY Hacker Young. We talk about measures to be taken for companies to survive. Are there any new measures to protect company share prices and or to prevent unwelcome hostile takeovers while in a temporary weak position due to uncertainty as to how and when government subsidies will be made? And that's from Stuart Bradley. Oops, I'm not sure what that is.
I think...
Yeah, are you there?
Again, this leaves us in the area of a work in progress. The FCA is looking at measures to provide some sort of protection for the share price going forward, and to provide protection to larger companies. We don't know what those proposals are going to actually look like, and hopefully we'll know over the next month or so what sort of realistic protection is going to be provided. We just don't know at this stage.
Thank you. I think at that point, we've still got another 9 open questions, but some of them are repeating things we've already answered, and some of them are very, very specific. What we'll do is we'll round those up and we'll respond directly to the people that have raised them. If you think of any other questions that you want to ask, then please do send the question into CIC. You can address it to Nora Neva, which her email address is nneva, that's nneva @cic.org.uk, and we will do our best to answer it. I've run 10 minutes over, but they were very full presentations, and I wanted to give as much time as possible to answering questions, and we've still kept the vast majority of you online through the webinar. So can I just thank Brian, Peter and Alasdair for giving up their very valuable time. I know how busy they all are at this time, and also to Maria for helping us with the hosting, and most of all to thank all of you for giving up your time to take part. And I wish you all a very safe time through these troubling, challenging times, and a good weekend. So with that, thank you. Our next webinar, just to finish off with, will be on mental health and well-being during these difficult times, which Maria is going to lead, and is on Monday at 2 o'clock. So if you would like to participate in that, you can register on via the CIC website. So thanks very much indeed.
Thanks, Graham. Thanks, Maria.
Thanks, Graham. Thanks, Maria.
Thank you.